A la Tulia Meldonia a Haramari essay. My name is Rainbow Dave, and in this series of videos, we're going to explore and explain how Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings movies fit into the wider world, the Legendarium of Professor J.R.R. Tolkien. But before we begin untangling the movies from the books, I do need to say that I absolutely love the movies. They're a huge part of my childhood, and although they're not 100% perfect, they are pretty damn close, and I do think they are a very faithful telling of Tolkien's story. But because I guess they are movies and they can't really run over 3.5 hours, there's just so much of Tolkien's world that they either have to condense or cut entirely. So what I want to do here is to try and enhance and situate the movies within the much wider, much broader tale that is Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Now, I guess the first thing that I really need to say here is that although we think of The Lord of the Rings as being a trilogy, and the movies are obviously a trilogy, Tolkien himself always saw his story as being split into 6 books, not 3. 6 parts of one big saga, one great volume. And as far as I'm aware, the only reason that it actually became 3 separate books is just a suggestion of the publishers, who thought maybe one giant saga might be a bit of a financial risk. I mean, I guess in 1954, no one knew whether The Lord of the Rings was gonna make its money back. So over these next 4 videos, I'm going to talk specifically about the first of these 6 books, a book which Tolkien called The Ring Sets Out. Now, if you are mainly familiar with the movies, that's all good. A lot of the story you will recognize. It begins with Bilbo's birthday party and ends with that epic scene of the Black Riders, the Ringwraiths, being washed away by the Great Flood at the fords of Bruinen. But there is so much more that happens in between that just didn't make it into the films. And so fan-favourite characters like Tom Bombadil and Glorfindel and these amazing locations like the Barrow Downs don't get quite as much love as I feel like they deserve. And so they're the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about a lot over these videos, and hopefully I'll be able to explain how the Lord of the Rings story fits into this vast and ancient world in which it's set. But I guess in this video, we should probably get this show on the road and start at the beginning. So both the books and the movies open with a prologue, although these 2 prologues focus on very different things. In the movies, we begin with a voiceover from Galadriel. And I really like this, because Galadriel was very much there when all this was going down. In fact, the dude who forged the 3 elven rings is Galadriel's cousin, technically her cousin once removed. So it makes a lot of sense that her narration is what begins this entire tale. Although, one thing I will clarify is that it's not really 100% accurate to say that Sauron gave 3 rings to the elves. The elven rings were actually made by an elf, and Sauron never touched them. Also, you see this guy in the background with the silver hair? So his name is Círdan. And Círdan is possibly my #1 favourite character in the entire Legendarium. Now, I'm sure I'll talk about Círdan in much more detail in later videos, and to be honest, he's not that important to The Lord of the Rings, although we do see him very briefly at the end of The Return of the King. But what's cool about him is that Tolkien describes Círdan as looking a little bit different to pretty much every other elf in the story. You see, Círdan is one of only 2 elves who Tolkien describes as having a beard. The other one is, of course, Matan, who I talked about in the Tale of Fëanor and the Silmarils. So it's hardly a great big deal in the grand scheme of things, but part of me does really wish that someone in hair and makeup had just stuck like a little silver beard onto this dude. It would have been a nice detail. Anyway, another tiny little detail that I will mention here is that it's not truly accurate to say that Sauron forged 9 rings for mortal men and 7 rings for the dwarves. You see, originally, he and Galadriel's cousin forged 16 rings of power together, and then Galadriel's cousin went off and on his own he forged the 3 elven rings, and Sauron, as we know, on his own, in secret, forged the 1. And it's only later that Sauron reclaimed the 16 and then divided them into the 9 and the 7, and he gave them to the men and the dwarves. So I guess it makes sense the movie had to simplify things a little bit, but I certainly don't think Tolkien states anywhere that there's any kind of visible difference between the rings that the men get and the rings that the dwarves get. It's implied that they are pretty much exactly the same. Now, next up we have this shot, which in my mind very much resembles this shot from The Two Towers. Now, in The Two Towers, the scene is obviously a village in Rohan being burned by Uruk-hai who were loyal to Saruman. But at this point in the prologue, we are thousands and thousands and thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings proper, and so there is absolutely no Rohan, there are no Uruk-hai, and there's not even a Saruman at this point in the story. So this may look like a village in Rohan, but I'm telling you, this ain't a village in Rohan. Now, Galadriel's line here,
"One by one, the free lands of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring,"
is definitely true, but what isn't said here is that it takes place over thousands and thousands of years, and there is a forgotten but very, very long period in Middle-earth history where Sauron ruled as the unopposed Dark Lord. He was king of the entire continent, well, more or less. Now, if I were to tell you that full story, I'd pretty much be chronicling the entirety of the Second Age, which I don't have time to do in this video. But, as Galadriel tells us, eventually, there were some who resisted.
"A last alliance of men and elves marched against the armies of Mordor."
Now, this is a line that always gets me. It's men and elves and dwarves. So Tolkien actually says that in the War of the Last Alliance, there weren't many dwarves who fought on either side, but there were some who fought on both sides. Now, we don't know very much about these evil dwarves who fought with Sauron, but we do know that under the command of King Durin IV, an army of long-beard dwarves from Khazad-dûm fought and died alongside the Last Alliance. So don't let the movies fool you. Sauron was brought down by an alliance of elves and men and dwarves. In fact, Tolkien even talks about an alliance of birds and beasts that also fight against Sauron. Although, just like with men and dwarves, there were some who fought in the Dark Lord's service. So here's another thing that I guess had to be condensed for the sake of the movies. You see, the War of the Last Alliance was not a battle fought on the slopes of Mount Doom, it was a war that lasted for 12 years. And this prologue does a good job at showing us that Elendil is the High King of men, but it also gives us a cameo of the High King of the Elves, whose name is Gil-Galad. Now we know this is Gil-Galad because he fights with Gil-Galad's weapon of choice, a mighty spear called Aeglos, which actually means icicle in the Elven language. But here's another little fun fact about Gil-Galad. You see, he is the great-grandson of the Noldor's High King, Finwë, who I spend a good deal of time talking about in the videos on Feanor and the Silmarils. So I do really appreciate and enjoy this little 2-second cameo that does a great job at kind of grounding the movies in this much wider world that is Tolkien's Legendarium. It's a great little attention to detail from the filmmakers. But it is at around this point that the prologue starts to deviate from what Tolkien actually wrote. You see, at this point in the story, Sauron is not the kind of unstoppable armoured overlord that he appears as in the movies. In fact, Sauron's body had already been destroyed once, only about 120 years earlier. So in this battle, he's not exactly at the top of his game. But he does, of course, possess the One Ring, and so he is still exceedingly powerful. And the series of events that lead up to Sauron losing the One Ring, I have to say, are so much more infinitely badass in Tolkien's writings than they appear in this prologue. So you see, Elendil is the High King of the Dunedain. He's not just one hit killed like he is in the movie. Instead, he and the Noldor's High King, Gil-Galad, fight a one-on-one duel, or I guess it's a two-on-one duel, against the Dark Lord himself. And the fight is epic. So I already said that Gil-Galad fights with his spear, Aeglos, and I reckon we all know that Elendil fights with the sword Narsil, which will one day be reforged into Anduril, the Flame of the West, the sword of Aragorn. Now, in this three-way fight, Elendil and Gil-Galad actually defeat Sauron, and they pretty much kill him. But their victory comes at a very high cost, because we are told by Tolkien that Gil-Galad is slain when he is burned alive by the fire of Sauron's hand. And, of course, we know Gil-Galad is not the only High King to be killed that day, because Elendil too is slain by Sauron, and as he falls, his sword breaks beneath him. So when the battle is over, Elendil and Gil-Galad are both dead, but Sauron too is crippled and broken. And so it's at this point that Isildur, the son of the king, takes up his father's sword, but instead of kind of randomly slashing at Sauron's fingers in what is an absurdly bad idea on Sauron's part to reach forward with his ring-bearing hand, in Tolkien's writing, Isildur simply cuts the ring from Sauron's finger, and it's more of an execution than a lucky strike. Now, in the movie, this takes us up to the death of Isildur, which is also very, very different in the books. You see, as much as I love the films, I do have to say that Isildur is one of, if not the most unfairly maligned characters in the movies. Like, he's pretty much portrayed as a villain, right? And that is so unfair. I mean, it is true that he could have destroyed the One Ring and saved everyone a whole lot of trouble, and he didn't do that, but that does not make him a bad guy. He was a king and a hero, and he took the ring as a weregild, kind of like a man price, to pay for the fact that Sauron killed not only his father, but also his brother and tens of thousands of other good men. Also, I don't want to go into it too much here, but that's not even close to the worst thing Sauron did to the men of Númenor. Now, it is true that he probably should have destroyed the ring, and yes, that makes Isildur a flawed man, but my question is, who isn't? All men are flawed. You know, even Frodo, who's supposed to be like the best hobbit ever, failed to destroy the ring when he stood there on the cracks of doom. So it's a little bit unfair to hold it against Isildur. And I've heard all kinds of things on the internet, I'm sure you've heard them too, about, oh, Elrond should have just pushed Isildur into the fire and saved everyone the trouble, but if he had done that, I don't think it would have ended well. Firstly, Isildur is directly descended from Elrond's brother, so if Elrond killed him, that would be kinslaying. Secondly, if Elrond, a powerful elven lord, took the ring by force and murdered its previous owner, Well, that's exactly how Smeagol acquired the ring, and I'm sure you all know that did not end well for him. So imagine if Gollum, instead of being a corrupted river hobbit, was a corrupted elven lord. That would be so much worse. So if there's one thing for you to take away from this video, it's to spare a thought for Isildur. He's not a perfect character, and his story is a tragic one, but Isildur was a good man who only ever wanted what was best for his people. Anyway, back to talking about the actual movie. I know the prologue doesn't state this anywhere, but I remember the first time I saw this scene, I assumed that Isildur was very close to Mordor, and these orcs were, I guess, avenging the Dark Lord not long after Saruman's defeat. But that is not the case at all. Isildur is actually slain at the Gladden fields, which are all the way up here, a long way from Mordor. And this ambush took place 2 years after the War of the Last Alliance, and so this wasn't some kind of conspiracy of Mordor, this was just a random orc warband who may probably have never even been to Mordor, and certainly didn't know that Isildur was carrying the ring. Now, that's not to say that the ring didn't play any kind of role in Isildur's death, it clearly did, and it's probable, although we're not told explicitly, but it is probable that the evil of the ring is kind of what drew the orcs towards Isildur and his men. But they didn't consciously know that Isildur was carrying it. And also, unlike in the movie, Isildur didn't just put on the one ring and run away like a coward. Isildur was many things, but he was not a coward. And he fought valiantly in defense of his 200 men and his 3 sons, who were also present. In fact, it wasn't until one of his sons was dead, another was dying, and his eldest son begged him to put on the ring and abandon them and get out of there, that Isildur reluctantly agreed. This was bigger than any of them. And so, for the good of all men, Isildur put on the ring and fled into the Anduin River. But unlike in this scene, the ring doesn't just fall off Isildur's finger, it doesn't betray him. Instead, Isildur is wearing the crown of his father, the crown of the Dunedain, which is called the Elendil. And inside this crown is a jewel that shines with a bright white light. Now, when Isildur puts the ring on his finger, he turns invisible, and the crown turns invisible, and the jewel turns invisible, but the light does not. And so in the darkness, this is visible to the orcs. And just like in the scene in the movie, Isildur is shot and killed, and the One Ring is lost in the mighty Anduin. And I have to say, I think the rest of the prologue, the movie absolutely nails. It concisely, but very accurately tells the story of how the ring was found, it came to Gollum, it came to Bilbo, and our story begins. But just before I move on, there's actually a really cool little scene that's not even in the Lord of the Rings books, it's in the Unfinished Tales. But basically, Tolkien tells us that after the Lord of the Rings finishes and Aragorn is made king, he goes with Gimli to Orthanc, to Saruman's tower, and there they try to uncover all the secrets of the now dead wizard. And Aragorn finds all kinds of treasures from Rohan that Grima Wormtongue presumably pilfered. But that's not all he finds. You see, Gimli discovers a secret door that Aragorn would not have been able to find, and inside they discover a casket that contains the Elendil of Isildur. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, the reason it's significant, is that this heavily implies that Saruman had been trawling the banks of the Anduin and searching for Isildur's body, and although we know he never found it, it seems he did find Isildur's crown. Now this means that Saruman had probably been searching for the One Ring for a lot longer than he had admitted to Gandalf. Now, this isn't really anything to do with the movie, but I do think it's a neat little detail about Saruman that kind of hints at his true intentions. You know, he'd been looking for the ring since day one. But anyway, that is the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring movie. But I did mention at the beginning of this video that the Fellowship of the Ring book, or The Ring Sets Out, has a prologue of its own. But this prologue covers very different material, and I think it gives us an interesting insight into Tolkien's priorities of what the reader really needs to know before this story begins. You see, all this information about Isildur and Sauron and the One Ring, none of that is included. That's not talked about until the second book in the Council of Elrond. Instead, Tolkien's prologue is split into 4 little sections. And whereas Peter Jackson's prologue gives us this epic history lesson, Tolkien's prologue simply concerns hobbits. In fact, the first one of these sections is called Concerning Hobbits. And it's basically just an overview of hobbits and their customs and their culture and how they came to settle in the Shire. Now, after this, there is another section which I feel is even more important to the story, and it is called Concerning Pipeweed. And right at the beginning, before the story's even begun, Tolkien gives us a little page and a half talking all about the different types of pipeweed and how it is a type of nicotine, it's a type of tobacco. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with cannabis. And we just get a nice detailed look at the more mundane side of life in the Shire. And this represents a really important difference between the movies and the books. Because whereas the movies begin with this epicness and then they kind of reel it back in and then we kind of have to escalate back to that epicness, the book begins so much slower and it really begins as a very small story about small people living in a quiet corner of the world. And that's something that we're going to see a lot more clearly in the next video. Big things start in small places, and they take a very long time to happen. And so when they do happen in the books, it feels even more epic. But anyway, before I finish this video, I do also want to quickly talk about the first proper chapter of the book, and that very, very iconic, beautiful scene that is the long-expected party. Now, in the films, this isn't too different from the books, but there are a few significant changes. Firstly, in the books, the party is actually a joint birthday celebration for Bilbo and for his second cousin once removed, Frodo, who is turning 33. But perhaps a more important difference is when Bilbo slips the One Ring onto his finger. So, as we all know, Bilbo turns invisible and he shocks everyone at the party. And he does this in the book too. But in the book, at the very moment he puts the ring on, Gandalf throws a blinding flash right where Bilbo was standing, which not only scares the heck out of Bilbo, but it also provides an explanation to the other hobbits about Bilbo's mysterious disappearance. And so they all blame Gandalf for this strangeness, which is a lot better than going around spreading rumours about a magical invisibility ring, which could land all of the Shire in a huge amount of trouble. And I really, really like this moment, because it demonstrates that even when Bilbo is 5 steps ahead of anyone else in the Shire, Gandalf is still at least 1 step ahead of him. And it just gives us a glimpse into quite how intelligent Gandalf really is. Now, there is one other big change between Bilbo's birthday party in the books and the movies, and that is the timing of it all. You see, as I've already said, the book begins a lot slower than the movies, and Bilbo's party actually takes place 17 years before Frodo goes off on his own adventure. So this means that although there is actually a reference to one of Gandalf's dragon fireworks in the books, it is not Merry and Pippin who set it off. In fact, although Pippin is present at the party, he's only 11 years old, which is particularly young for hobbits because they don't come of age, they don't even become adults until their 33rd birthday, which incidentally, remember, that is what Frodo is celebrating. So at the time of Bilbo and Frodo's long-expected party, Pippin is a very, very, very young hobbit indeed. Now, I am well aware that we have barely scratched the surface of either the movies or the books, but I reckon this is where I'm going to finish for this episode, because after this point, as I say, there is a huge time jump. And although the movies skip over it, an awful lot happens in that time in Tolkien's world, and so that is what I'm going to talk about in the next video. So to make sure you don't miss that, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and until next time, dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaeh Melanin.